Welcome to Crash Course Apologetics, where I summarize the work of Christian scholars in animated videos and interviews. This is another video in our Ask a Scholar series, but this one is going to be on the topic of God and infinity. I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Rubio of Princeton University. And here's the question, Dr. Rubio. Can God count to infinity twice? If he can, does that mean the number of past events could be infinite? If he can't, how can he have the foreknowledge of an infinite future, or at least of an infinite possible future? So, what are your thoughts?
Okay, so that's a really interesting question, and it gets into a bunch of issues. So I'm just going to kind of try to sort them out one by one as we move through something like an answer. To start with, you've got this choice point on whether you put your God inside or outside of time, and that will make a difference, especially to the twice part. So I'll start with what I think of as the easier route. If you've got God inside of time, so that means it will make sense to talk about God doing more than one thing. If God's outside of time, you've got to say that God has just one act with multifaceted reverberations throughout the created order. So if God is inside of time, the next question is, could God count to infinity? And this relates to a question about how we're able to move, believe it or not. So way back in ancient Greek times, a philosopher named Zeno came up with a bunch of paradoxes of motion. And one of these paradoxes was to argue that motion is impossible, and here was Zeno's argument. So you're going to move from point A to point B. To do that, you have to go halfway there to point C. In order to then move from C to B, you have to go halfway there to point D. In order to move from D to B, you have to move halfway there to point E. And of course, this can go on infinitely. So Zeno says, in order to move from point A to point B, you have to actually perform infinitely many actions, and this is impossible. The answer I favor to this paradox is to say, well, actually, you can perform infinitely many actions if you do it fast enough. And so, in our case, when we just take a step, we perform what's known as a super task. And if we can do a super task, it seems pretty easy to infer that God can also do a super task. In which case, counting to infinity once or twice wouldn't be a big deal for God. Now, the fact that God could do that wouldn't necessarily tell you anything about an infinite past. So if God's performing a super task with a similar kind of structure, God could count to infinity in the next 5 minutes. You just take the first half to count to 1, half of what remains to count to 2, half of what remains to count to 3, half of what remains to count to 4, and so on. And by the end of your 5 minutes, of course, you'll be booking it in the last little bit. You'll get through all of the natural numbers, and that is one way of counting to infinity. Just a small aside here. There are different sizes of infinity. So far, and in this discussion, I'm just going to assume that the infinity of the natural numbers is the one we're interested in. If we're talking about even bigger infinities, things get more complicated. So God could do it once, God could do it twice. That's not a problem. Now, if we want an infinite past, we have to think about, is there a way to model that consistently? Could we get a mathematical representation where the past goes backward infinitely, perhaps without a first element? And in order to do that, we kind of have to consult our model theory. And it turns out there are models that do that. Now, that doesn't directly connect with the counting question, but if you're worried that there's some kind of paradox about counting to infinity or counting down from infinity, there's not. It gets a little counterintuitive, but there are clear mathematics that let us do that. Now let's turn to the slightly more difficult branch, namely the part where God's outside of time, in which case, speaking strictly and literally of God doing anything twice is a bit problematic. Because God's outside of time, there might be something like logical priority in God. So you could talk about God thinking about what God wants to create prior to God creating. But because everything's timeless, there's really just one act that God does. Now, we, being creatures in time, will perceive different after effects of that one divine act at different times, and will perceive them as different things. But God will have just done the one thing. So the way to formulate the question, if you're an eternalist, is going to be, could God's act be perceived by us as, among other things, two countings to infinity? And there it gets a little tricky, because the way I described it before, where God kind of counts in 5 minutes and gets faster and faster and faster as he goes, by the end, we're not going to be able to perceive what's going on. God will be like, 1, 2, 3. And by the end, he'll be like, yeah, I made it. Just trust me on this one. But supposing there was a creature who could perceive indefinitely quick things, that creature could perceive God as having counted to infinity twice. But once again, that won't tell that creature much about whether or not there's a backwards infinity of events or a forwards infinity of things to come. For those, again, you'd have to turn to some kind of mathematical model. There are good ones out there, but there's a whole other kind of range of issues that come up in that debate.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm just curious, do you have a favored view here of God being in time or outside of time?
I think God's outside of time. I'm pretty much a by-the-book classical theist. So outside of time, unchangeable, unable to feel passio, any of that. Within the literature on God and infinity, there's this kind of big asymmetry between infinite pasts and infinite futures. So especially for people who think God is in time, they don't want to talk about a time where God ends. And so they're kind of forced into thinking that an infinite future is okay. Whereas an infinite past, people get a little queasy about, sometimes for empirical reasons and sometimes for conceptual reasons. So for empirical reasons, our best astrophysics, when you leave out sort of very speculative cosmologies, says that time begins at the Big Bang, more or less. That more or less is kind of important, but there's a pretty strong empirical argument to be made that the past is in fact finite, regardless of what it might have been. Then there are all of these arguments that tend to rely on different paradoxes that say the past, in fact, couldn't have been infinite. My attitude towards those is that they generally don't work. They generally show that the author has succeeded in describing an impossible situation that involves an infinite past, but there are plenty of other situations involving the infinite past that are kind of unparadoxical, and so, to my mind, unproblematically possible. Probably the best thing to read if you want the opposing view is Alex Pruse's book, Infinity, Causation, and Paradox, which is very sharp and very well written, but with which I disagree. So if you end up thinking an infinite past is impossible, that doesn't bar you from thinking that there could be an infinitely long or an indefinitely long future, a future that just keeps on going. You might think that you never go through so many future days that you end up with infinitely many days in your past. But as long as you're not moving too fast, that's fine.
All right, well, this one's definitely given me a lot of food for thought, so I'll have to rewatch this and listen to you lay out all the options. But thank you for answering this question of the week.
Yep. Sounds good. Have a good one.
If you enjoyed this video, then please consider liking and subscribing to this channel. Also, if you'd like to participate in Ask a Scholar, you can do that by going to www.patreon.com/ccapologetics and sign up for level 2 or level 3. I greatly appreciate your support, and we'll see you soon.